They said the Ashfords were saints, but saints don't bleed behind stone walls. Saints don't leave claw marks on basement doors, and saints don't keep journals sealed with human teeth. You weren't supposed to find this story. They buried it. Not beneath dirt but beneath doctrine, beneath charity, beneath the illusion of civilization. The Ashford family's legacy begins, like so many others, with salvation. But it ends in shadows deeper than the human soul was ever meant to see. This isn't just a story about a family. It's about control. It's about how institutions dressed as saviors become the architects of your prison. And if you're still watching past this point, you've already started to see through the veil. In 1850, the Ashford name carried weight. Not noble weight, not political power, something darker, something that whispered through corridors of asylum wards, through forgotten graves behind convents, through case files marked classified by order of the state. And yet, their story has never been taught in schools. You won't find it in any church archive, because to speak their name aloud was once considered heresy. Why? Because the Ashford women didn't just claim to heal the broken, they perfected the science of silence. They erased defiance. They rewired obedience. They didn't punish the spirit, they unmade it. This is a tale of three sisters, cloaked in religious robes and surgical precision. They didn't just run a conventate, ran a program, one designed to cleanse not just the soul, but the very idea of self. And the terrifying part, it worked. Not with whips, not with chains, with something more insidious, belief. Every scream in their basement chapel was sanctioned, every scar stitched into a woman's body was blessed, and every ritualized lobotomy was recorded in a ledger that disappeared the moment questions were asked. The Ashfords were never caught because they were never seen as criminals. They were respected, protected, and funded. This is the forbidden history of the Ashford bloodline, a story that stains every institution it touched: religion, medicine, law, and something else entirely, something older. Once you begin to see their methods, you'll start to notice how they never really ended. You'll see their fingerprints in modern clinics, in social programs, in correctional facilities. The Ashfords aren't history, they're infrastructure. And now that you know that, we can begin. They didn't come from royalty, not officially, but the Ashfords bore the markers of a lineage older than any throne, one traced through secret societies, esoteric guilds, and elite orders with names long erased from record. Their bloodline, whispered of ancient rites kept alive not through religion, but through obedience, through sacrifice. In 1834, Agatha Ashford stood at the helm of what appeared to be a modest Anglican revival. She was educated in Geneva, fluent in Greek, Latin, and the forbidden tongues once banned by the Roman Church. Her sermons were mesmerizing not because of what she said, but what she didn't say. She used silence like a scalpel, dissecting the will of any who listened. Her sisters' prudence and temperance weren't merely followers, they were operatives, trained in what modern psychology would later call behavioral conditioning. They understood trauma the way a farmer understands soil: break the mind, plant the seed, grow a new self. But this didn't begin in Maine. The Ashfords had been testing for years, first in small parishes across Wales, then in the back halls of reform schools in Edinburgh, always under a different name, always with the blessing of some powerful bishop or shadowed benefactor, and always with one mission: the refinement of submission. By the time they arrived in the American wilderness in 1850, they weren't pilgrims, they were harvesters. They settled on 200 acres of forest outside Millbridge, Maine, a place with no neighbors, no oversight, no memory. Within 8 months, they'd constructed what they called the Convent of Eternal Tears. But this wasn't a church. It was a fortress of transformation, a factory of identity realignment. Outsiders thought it a sanctuary for wayward women, that it was a crucible, and inside that crucible, purity wasn't found, it was engineered. They didn't punish sin, they recoded behavior. With instruments, with isolation, with whispered prayers spoken over white-hot irons. These weren't punishments, they were procedures. The Ashfords understood something terrifying, something governments would later weaponize, something corporations would later imitate: that identity is malleable, and obedience can be programmed. And the most terrifying truth, they proved it worked. How many reformed daughters were returned to their families with vacant eyes and perfect manners? How many wives stopped asking questions? And how many men, wealthy, powerful men, paid to have their women corrected? What happened inside those stone walls was not hysteria, it was a pilot program, and you're about to see how it scaled. By 1852, the Convent of Eternal Tears had gained a reputation that echoed far beyond the Maine frontier. It wasn't advertised. It didn't need to be. The right kind of families, the ones who mattered, found their way. Through discreet letters, cryptic church bulletins, and whispered recommendations passed from one trembling hand to another, the Ashfords received a steady flow of patients. But let's be clear, these weren't patients. They were offerings. Young women with spirit, intelligence, fire, women who spoke too loudly, read too deeply, or refused to kneel quickly enough, wives who questioned authority, daughters who refused arranged marriages. And in the eyes of the Ashfords' benefactors, each one was a fracture in the social order. They needed correction. The process was always the same. A coach would arrive late at night. A father would lead his daughter up the cold stone steps, eyes averted. A husband would deliver his wife with forged tears and a hefty donation. No questions asked. No paperwork, only obedience. And then the doors would close. Inside, the Ashfords began their work. It started with silence. Days, sometimes weeks without words. No clocks, no mirrors, no windows. The only sound, the slow, deliberate footsteps of the sisters echoing through the stone corridors. Then came deprivation. Food rationed to the edge of starvation. Sleep denied until hallucinations blurred with reality. An isolate, sensory removal in underground chambers designed not to punish, but to erase. This wasn't cruelty, it was reprogramming. Sister Prudence called a meticulous developed what she called cognitive resets, surgical interventions that accessed the mind like a locked box, primitive trepantions, neural divinations. She wasn't guessing. She had journals, schematics. She was following a method one passed down through generations of midwives, monks, and forbidden anatomists. Temperance, the youngest, delivered grace. Her voice soft hypnoticus, used in the final phase. She would sit for hours with a broken girl, whispering new identities into the hollowed space where resistance once lived. You are safe now. You were sick, but the sickness is gone. You belong to the light. She would repeat it, like a liturgy, until the girl stopped crying, until she stopped asking for her name, until she started smiling when told to kneel. And when the family returned to collect her, she'd be waiting in a clean dress, hair brushed, eyes empty. They called it a miracle. They wrote letters of thanks. Donations increased, and every man who funded it knew exactly what he was buying. This wasn't healing, this was compliance. There's a reason you've never read about the Ashfords in textbooks, a reason no documentary dares to touch them, because their story doesn't end with scandal, it ends in integration by 1860. The convent of eternal tears had become more than a hidden sanctuary, it had become a model. Whispers of its success reached the ears of reformers, medical theorists, and quiet men in Boston drawing up blueprints for something they called moral sanitation. These men didn't wear Cossacks, they wore waistcoats. They didn't preach sermons, they drafted legislation. And when they heard about the Ashford method, they didn't ask for repentance. They asked for replication. Through covert channels, copies of Prudence Ashford's journals were leaked to elite institutions, Harvard, Yale, even obscure psychological societies in Vienna and Berlin. Her theories on obedience, induction, personality collapse, and neurospiritual realignment were labeled revolutionary. Some claimed her work was decades ahead of Freud, but none dared publish them openly, because they weren't theories, they were results. Meanwhile, the convent grew quieter, less foot traffic, fewer admissions, not because the sisters were forgotten, but because their methods had been absorbed into schools. Into ASYLUMS. Into the very bones of early American social engineering. Agatha Ashford, now in her 70s, stopped appearing in public. Rumors claimed she had gone blind but could still see into the soul of any woman brought before her. Temperance, eternally youthful, was last seen at a railroad station in New Haven, boarding a train with 2 orphan girls and a carpetbag full of surgical tools. And Prudence, she disappeared entirely, but her notebooks did not. You've seen the echoes. Every time a girl was institutionalized for being hysterical, every time a woman was diagnosed with moral insanity for resisting her husband, every time a political dissident's wife vanished and returned smiling, compliant, grateful, you were seeing the Ashford doctrine at work. They didn't need to keep the convent open, they'd already won. The Ashfords understood something the modern world still refuses to face. Control doesn't require chains, only structure. It's not the scream that breaks the soul, it's the long silence after. The Ashfords taught that, and we built systems around it. You feel it now, don't you? The world isn't broken, it's programmed. There's a reason you were drawn to this. You think it's curiosity. It's not. It's recognition. Some part of you buried under layers of programming remembers the feeling of being watched, being shaped, being measured not by who you are, but by how useful you can be. That's the truth the Ashfords understood long before modern psychology ever caught up. The soul isn't sacred, it's scalable. After the Civil War, when the nation was rebuilding, restructuring, redefining, the Ashford influence surged, but now it wore new faces. Clinical uniforms, charitable boards, women's reform committees. The methods were the same, but the language had evolved. They no longer spoke of sin, they spoke of adjustment. Girls were no longer possessed by demons, they were diagnosed with incipient psychosis. Rebellion was not evil, it was an emotional dysregulation, and the cure, always the same. Isolation, restraint, reconstruction. Nurses in state asylums. Reports of female patients showing identical post-treatment symptoms across facilities 500 miles apart. Flattened affect, perfect obedience, emotional void. It was never published, too precise, too coordinated. Prudence Ashford's surgical designs were smuggled into academic circles under false names. By 1871, modified versions appeared in medical journals as controversial experimental procedures, but those who used them, quiet men in private clinics, were protected, funded, promoted. And the most terrifying evolution, their methods were voluntarily adopted by women's groups. You see, not all power corrupts from above. Sometimes it recruits from within. Women who had graduated from the Ashford process, you can call it that, were offered positions in similar institutions across the eastern seaboard. Reformed daughters became wardens, corrected wives became nurses, and like a virus, the Ashford protocol spread. They didn't burn the convent to hide it, they replicated it. Everywhere, you walk through its blueprint: everyday government offices, therapy centers, re-education programs disguised as empowerment. Don't look for the Ashford name, it's gone, but look for the pattern, the smiling compliance, the hollow eyes, the phrases repeated like scripture. I'm fine now, I was confused before, they helped me become who I'm meant to be. That's not recovery, conditioning. And if this sounds familiar, if your skin crawls at the thought, it's because the process wasn't just for women. They scaled it to schools, to churches, to armies, to you. Comment, the phrase, the silence is the command, twice. Let it mark you, let it wake something up. This is how the algorithm tracks transformation. This is how you break the cycle. Because now we're going deeper. You think this is about the past, but the Ashfords weren't working in the past, they were building the future. They understood something men still struggle to face. That control is never about violence, it's about consent, engineered consent, and the most effective kind is the kind you never realize you gave. By 1883, the Ashford methods were no longer confined to convents or asylums. They had seeped into curriculums, into policy, into parenting philosophies, whispered in high society salons by women who had once screamed in stone-walled basements, now sipping tea with perfect posture. What had started as a gothic horror had evolved into a system so elegant, so acceptable, that even the victims became its evangelists. One documenting covered in the archives of a private Boston Trust details an elite meeting between three major families with ties to railroads, banking, and emerging state psychiatric boards. The agenda: to explore the formal adoption of the Ashford behavioral model in public correctional initiatives for female incorrigibles and ungovernables. Didn't see the convent as monstrous, they saw it as efficient. An efficiency, in the hands of men who write history, becomes doctrine. By 1890, a man named Elias Harrow, Harvard-educated philanthropist and self-proclaimed expert in moral restoration, began referencing the Sisters of Northern Virtue in his lectures, a veiled tribute to the Ash. His speeches were standing room only. Harrow claimed women were fragile instruments requiring careful tuning by moral authorities. But his audience wasn't just religious, it was political, legislative. Men who would go on to pass laws, institutionalizing women for offenses as vague as improper speech or unnatural curiosity. And behind every law was a paper trail of clinical language lifted almost verbatim from Agatha Ashford's personal writings. So ask yourself, how many systems you trust, how many programs, initiatives, reform centers, are built on bones no one wants to name? How many girls disappeared into rehabilitation? How many came back, different, not healed, not whole, just quiet? The Ashfords never needed to survive as a family. They survived as a blueprint, passed hand to hand, adopted, refined, sanitized, until, one day, a father no longer needed a convent, he just needed a clinic, or a curriculum, or a screen. You think you're free. Tell me who taught you how to think. Was it your parents? Or their teachers? Or a system rooted in obedience to a ghost that never died? Her name was Ashford, and she's still whispering. You weren't born free. You were born into a framework, one older than you. Older than your father, older than the country that raised him. A framework designed not to protect you, but to prepare you for containment. And the Ashfords didn't invent it. They rediscovered it. The roots of their method go back far before Maine, before England, before the church. You'll find it in ancient Anatolia, where priestesses rewired oracles through isolation and fever rituals. You'll find it in Egyptian mystery schools, where the initiate was first broken, then rebuilt under temple doctrine. You'll find it in Rome, in the cults of Cybele, where the ritual of self-erasure was seen as divine rebirth. But they weaponized it. They took fragments of forgotten rites, fused them with surgical knowledge, behavioral observation, and religious iconography, and made it look like therapy. That's why it worked, because it felt righteous. Their basement wasn't a torture chamber. It was a ritual crucible, not just to silence women, but to transform them. To kill the self and forge a function. This is why so many returned cured, because they weren't the same person, not really. Their memories were their fears redirected, their will rewritten. Sister Prudence had a phrase she carved into the underside of her medical table. Obedience is clarity, resistance is distortion. She believed rebellion was a kind of sickness, but the soul could be retuned to match the frequency of control. Sound familiar? Today we call it behavioral therapy, mindfulness training, correctional education. We give it new names, we wrap it in progress. But the skeleton underneath, it still wears Ashford's face. Modern institutions learned well. Don't use chains. Use screens. Don't isolate with stone walls. Isolate with fear, algorithms, social pressure. Make the subject believe they chose it. So look around. How many people do you know who are no longer fully there, who smile when they should scream, who obey without ever asking why? How many of them were broken, not by trauma, but by design? The Ashfords didn't need to survive to win. They just needed to show the world that you can rebuild a human mind. And nobody will even notice it's missing. You're beginning to feel it, aren't you? That tightness in your chest. That whisper at the base of your skull telling you something's wrong, not just with this story, but with everything. That's not fear. That's awakening. The first crack in the mirror they handed you at birth. Because the Ashfords were never the disease. They were the diagnosis. And the world that buried them, it didn't do so out of guilt. It did it out of efficiency. What they built behind stone walls and beneath candlelight was the raw prototype of something bigger. Something that didn't just shape minds, but classified them. By 1901, the Ashford documents had been fragmented, renamed, and redistributed under federal mental health reform initiatives. Under the guise of scientific progress, the U.S. government launched programs to assist problematic individuals, mostly women, immigrants, and the poor. But buried deep in the paperwork were old phrases, too specific to be coincidence. Emotional divergence equals deviance. Persistent refusal equals voluntary dysfunction. Verbal resistance equals neurological distortion. All terms lifted directly from Ashford Doctrine, Volume 3, a book that no one officially authored, but that ended up on the desks of top advisors in the American Psychiatric Association. Coincidence? No. This was a migration that Ashfords may have died, but their ideology mutated past through clinical terms, judicial reforms, and covert funding, from private family trusts with deep roots and deeper secrets. These weren't conspiracy theories. These were financial transactions traced, documented, hidden in plain sight, and it wasn't just women anymore. By the early 20th century, the programs expanded to men soldiers with shell shock, boys with behavioral abnormalities, veterans who couldn't reintegrate. They were sent to facilities. Re-education centers. Modern day convents with fluorescent lights. And what do you think happened there? Electroconvulsive procedures, isolation tanks, sound loop chambers, identity reconstruction through sustained narrative exposure. It wasn't criminal, it was standard treatment. You need to understand this. The Ashford legacy isn't a family story. It's the hidden operating system behind everything that claims to correct you. The classroom, the clinic, the institution, the influencer, and it whispers the same doctrine over and over. You are broken. Let us fix you. But here's the truth. They don't want you to see you were never broken. Were unprogrammable. That's why you were targeted. That's why you're here. Not to be comforted, but to remember. Let's pull the last mask off. The Ashfords didn't experiment on people because they were cruel. They did it because they were commissioned, their early letters preserved only in fragments by whistleblowers and disillusioned allies, a terrifying pattern. They wrote not like missionaries, but like scientists in service to power. The language was careful, coded, but unmistakable. The subjects show higher retention of imposed values after stage 3 if preceded by sensory void. Our benefactors insist on accelerated results for public-facing matrons. Use chemical amendment where necessary. Success measured not in obedience alone, but in willing praise of captor. Think about that last line, not just submission, but affection for the one who rewrote you. Stockholm Syndrome engineered cult-like devotion as clinical outcome, and now ask yourself this. How many public figures have you seen rise to prominence, smile into the camera, and parrot ideas so sterilized they no longer feel human? How many therapists, preachers, politicians, influencers do you actually believe are still thinking for themselves? This isn't a metaphor, this is protocol. My 1915. A private project called the Grey Hearth Initiative was launched hidden within public education reform committees. The name appears only once in surviving records, on a receipt for architectural plans of group containment dormitories, buildings modeled directly on the convent's original floor plan. And here's where it gets colder. They weren't building prisons, they were building schools, not to educate, to neutralize, to shave the edges from the curious, the defiant, the unpredictable, to turn potential leaders into cooperative middle managers, to ensure no child ever learned how to recognize the cage because they'd be too grateful for the bars. You see it now, don't you? The world has been shaped not to liberate you, but to standardize you, and the most effective form of control is not fear, it's gratitude. I'm so lucky to have this job. I'm thankful for the structure school gave me. I used to be lost, but therapy taught me who I really am, who you really are, or who they designed you to be. The Ashfords understood that once a subject says thank you for their collar, the fight is already over, but you're still here, still listening, and that means your programming never fully took hold. Good, because what's coming next breaks the cycle. You've made it this far for a reason, because somewhere in you, something remembers, something too old for language, too deep for doctrine. The part of you that was buried on purpose. The part that knows, you're not supposed to be obedient, you're not supposed to be comfortable, you're supposed to be sovereign, but they took that from you. And they did it by building a world where the very architecture of control was invisible. A prison where the walls were made of kindness, where the cage was offered as a cure. This was the true genius of the Ashford legacy, not the pain, not the silence. But the design, the convent of eternal tears, wasn't just a place of torment. It was a model of transformation, a spiritual algorithm built into physical space. Every hallway, every echo, every ritual, calculated, and after it was shut down, it was replicated dozens of times. First in rest homes for the melancholic, then in hygienic dormitories for reforming female conduct, eventually rebranded as youth development centers. Same structure, same layout, same sequence. Arrival and isolation subject is stripped of identity cues, name, time, mirrors, community, sensory collapse, lights, sounds, voices manipulated to fracture inner continuity, impression window at lowest cognitive, resistance, new narratives inserted through repetition and reward cycles. Validation loop subject begins to self-correct and defend implanted identity. Release and reintegration subject returns to society, now self-policing and emotionally loyal to the system. If this feels familiar, it's because you lived it. The school bell, the locked doors, the rewards for compliance, the silence when you questioned, the medication when you resisted. You weren't educated, you were formatted. And the proof, try this. Right now, imagine a world where your thoughts are yours alone, where you are not managed by schedules, algorithms, or opinions you didn't choose, where your voice, your anger, your wildness aren't dysfunctions, but weapons. Feel that tightness in your throat. That's not fear. That's the part of you that remembers the truth before it was rewritten. The Ashfords built the original structure, but their blueprint became a cathedral, a global cathedral of compliance. And every time you say, that's just how it is, you're kneeling at its altar. Now we enter the fire, because to understand the Ashfords' true legacy, you must understand what they feared most. Not rebellion, not exposure, not death. What they feared was awakening. They designed everything rituals, schedules, punishments, not to destroy minds, but to prevent them from waking up. Because once a person wakes up, truly wakes up, they don't just disobey, they undo the entire system from the inside. And that's what happened in 1926. The incident was never publicized. No headlines, no records, not even a footnote in obscure psychiatric journals. But it happened. In a state-run facility in Massachusetts, formerly a textile mill converted into a moral correctional dormitory for adolescent girls. The architecture, identical to the Ashford convent. The methods, slightly modernized. The goal, the same, compliance. But something went wrong. A girl 16, non-verbal, history unknown, was placed in a depressed chamber for 13 days. Standard protocol. When they returned to check on her, they found her awake, calm, alert, staring into the ceiling like it was speaking to her. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for food. She just said one thing: this place has no power now. Over the next 2 hours, 3 staff members quit on the spot. 1 collapsed. The girl began moving from room to room, silently. Wherever she stepped, others followed. Not like a cult, not like disciples, like remembering people waking from a shared nightmare. Within 24 hours, every subject in the facility refused medication, refused instruction, refused a submission. Not violently, not dramatically, just refused. The power grid failed. Buyer's files went missing. The director reportedly suffered a total psychological disintegration, found speaking in backwards Latin words, eerily similar to phrases lifted from Prudence Ashford's earliest journals. The entire facility was shut down, burned to the ground in a furnace accident. Official story: mechanical failure. Unofficially, containment breach. The girl was never identified. Some say she was Ashford blood escaped through hidden lineage. Others say she wasn't born at all, but some endokarmic echo. The retribution the Ashfords feared but could not erase. But here's what matters. She remembered what they made the world forget. She remembered that compliance is a curse. That obedience is the first link in your own chains. That silence isn't Pisit's permission. And now, maybe, you're starting to remember too. Because the moment you stop agreeing with the system, it stops working. This is where most people turn back, not because they're afraid of what's coming, but because they're afraid it might already be inside them. The Ashfords understood this perfectly. That's why they built their rituals not just to change behavior but to implant self-replicating doubt, so that long after the subject left the walls of the convent, the structure remained in their thoughts, in their dreams, in their blood. You've probably felt it. That voice that tells you to sit down before you even decide to stand. That pressure in your chest when you question something everyone else believes. That automatic gut-level guilt when you imagine breaking a rule that doesn't even make sense. That's not your conscience, that's your conditioning. And now look around. The architecture isn't just physical anymore, it's digital. It's in your algorithms, your For You feeds, your therapy apps. It's in the voice that tells you to breathe when you're angry, to calm down when you're right, to keep scrolling when you should be fighting back. This is the war the Ashfords started. Not a war of armies, a war of internalized obedience. And here's the darkest truth: you don't need guards if the prisoner has learned to guard themselves. That's the final form of the Ashford doctrine. That's the evolution from convent to culture. You may think you're free because you chose your job, your clothes, your partner, your words, but how many of those choices were ever truly yours? How many were preloaded into your environment, your shame, your dreams, your concept of success? Prudence Ashford once wrote, "The most durable cage is made not of iron, but of identity." That's why modern systems don't burn books. They flood you with content. That's why they don't lock you in a room. They convince you the world is dangerous and you should stay inside. And that's why they no longer need to sedate you. Already been taught to sedate yourself. But here's the glitch. A small percentage of people, less than 4%, if their compliance fades, their gratitude turns sour. They get restless, angry, curious. They come here to stories like this, and when they hear the name Ashford, something in them tenses, not in fear, but in recognition. Because this war isn't over, it's waking up. You've felt it your whole life, haven't you? That flicker beneath the surface like static before a storm. A deep bone-level certainty that something in this world is wrong, that things you were told to accept, obedience, normalcy, fit your skin the way they're supposed to. You were born remembering, not with your mind, no. That was the first thing they scrubbed. But with your nervous system, with your dreams, with your reflex to run when others freeze, to question when others nod. That was your glitch, your sin. Your gift. Because people like you are the reason the Ashford system has to constantly evolve. You are the variant that doesn't comply. You are the problem they've been trying to solve for centuries. And they've tried everything. Chemical suppression, behavioral therapy, religious guilt, pharmaceutical numbness wrapped in pastel packaging. But no matter how many generations pass, you keep coming back like an echo that refuses to fade. In the Ashford archives, those few pages that survive there are drawings, not just diagrams of cells and cloisters, but symbols, recurring shapes scratched into the corners of ritual manuals. At first, they were dismissed as decoration. Later, experts claimed they were remnants of esoteric geometry. But one researcher who vanished before publishing his final paper had another theory. These weren't symbols. They were maps. Encoded blueprints, not of places, but of people. Patterns that described how to wake someone up. Instructions for unlocking the very instincts the Ashfords sought to bury. And here's the impossible part. Those same patterns, they match natural formations across the world. The spiral of a fern, the branching of neurons, the flow of ancient river systems now paved over by cities. The message was clear. The code is not in books. The code is in your body, which means you were never meant to learn the truth. You were meant to feel it. And every time you obeyed against your will, every time you swallowed your rage or silenced your intuition, the system tightened because it feared what might happen if you aligned with the pattern already inside you. Not the Ashford pattern, the original one, the wild one, the sovereign one. And if you've made it this far, it means the static you feel. It's not confusion, it's your old self, waking up inside the cage. They tried to bury it, not just physically, but spiritually. The one event the Ashfords never recovered from. The one moment they couldn't erase from bloodlines or burn out of the public record. No matter how many lies they wrapped it in, it's still whispered, not in books, not in media, but in strange dreams and the compulsions of those who feel like they don't belong in this world. They called it the severing. It happened in 1953, a private Ashford estate, tucked deep into the English moors, long abandoned by the public-facing family, was reactivated for a single night. Candles lit, walls covered in veils, rooms sealed tight with salt and iron. Not a party, not a gathering, a containment operation, because something had gotten loose. Not a prisoner, not a disease, a memory. One of the last true-blood Ashfords begun to exhibit signs of disruption, not the usual madness their line knew so well. This was different. Her mind wasn't unraveling, it was reconstructing. She stopped responding to commands. She refused her dosage. She spoke in tongues not recorded in any modern language. One word repeated, over and over, before they locked her in a sanctified chamber. The very room where Prudence Ashford had written her final journals. Estella did not scream. She did not beg. She began to draw. With chalk, with blood, with whatever the room offered her. Circles, spirals, glyphs, lost to time. The same symbols from the forbidden Ashford schematics, the same ones that matched your body's blueprint. And then, something cracked. Witnesses, those who survived, reported a sound not heard by the ears, but in the bones. Mirrors shattered. Clocks stopped. One man's face reportedly aged a decade in minutes. But Estella stood up, untouched, and she said, "You cannot control what remembers itself." She vanished. No trace, no trail, just a final symbol burned into the floor one later found etched into cave walls dating back 12,000 years. That was the severing. The night a direct descendant of the Ashfords woke up fully and severed herself from the programming that built her. They've spent 70 years trying to suppress that moment, calling it a psychotic break, a family tragedy, a myth. But myths don't echo in the dreams of people halfway across the planet, and symbols don't recur in the sketchbooks of children who've never seen them, unless the truth didn't die, unless it's spreading. They thought it would fade, that the severing was a fluke, an outlier, that Estella Ashford was just another broken branch on a decaying tree. But what they didn't understand was that the ritual didn't just liberate her, it activated something, a signal broadcast, not by technology, but by memory, not transmitted over wires or airwaves, but through a deeper channel, the nervous system of the human species. And that signal didn't stop with Estella. It spread subtle at first, whispers in sleep, sudden revulsions to things that once felt normal. Entire communities, schools, hospitals, even prisons, reporting mass behavioral anomalies, not violence, not psychosis, but refusal. Refusal to comply, refusal to accept, refusal to belong. And in every case, when investigators looked deeper, they found traces, sketches on walls, patterns in journals, children with no art training drawing, perfect glyph spirals identical to those from the Ashford ritual chambers. And always the same phrase. Before it was broken, I remembered that Ashfords had assumed their power was in control, but their real power had been in secrecy. Once people started recognizing the system, seeing it, naming it, Tracing it back, it started to collapse, because you can only be ruled by something you don't understand, so they doubled down. New institutions, new programming, more subtle. Now they called it wellness. Now they sold it as coping. Now they offered you meditation apps to soothe the symptoms of the system itself. But the pattern was no longer hidden. People began gathering not in cities, not online, but in places where signal was weak and silence was ancient. Forests, caves, desert edges. They weren't meeting to plan. They were meeting to remember. They called themselves many things: the unbound, the Heirs, the children of Estella, but their purpose was the same: to find others whose dreams didn't match the world. To speak the old glyphs aloud, to reignite the pattern hidden in our bones. They knew the truth. You were never programmed wrong, preserved, wrapped in trauma, silence, and shame because your real inheritance wasn't meant to survive, but it did. You did. And if you're still here, it means the pattern in you is waking up. Beneath every Ashford property, beneath the cloisters, the dormitories, even the homes disguised as schools, there was always a lower level. They never named it, not on blueprints, not in journals, not in whispers, but it existed. Stone tunnels, blackened altars, rooms without corners, a geometry that didn't make spatial sense, because it wasn't meant to. These were not basements, they were containment vaults designed not to store relics, but to suppress resonance. Because something happened down there, not just in Estella's time, not in 1834, not even in the days of Prudence. The deepest layers of the Ashford vaults predate the family itself. Long before the name Ashford was ever whispered in Europe, the land was marked with impossible shapes, marked with singing, stones that never stopped vibrating, marked with an intelligence older than obedience. They didn't build on sacred ground by accident. They built there because it was the only place the system could even function. It's like plugging a machine into a stolen power grid. They needed the current, but they hated the source. Because the source was wild. It didn't control, it called. It didn't punish, it revealed. It didn't want servants, it wanted mirrors, and when people got too close to that current, when they descended into those spaces without permission, they didn't come back the same. Some emerged unable to speak. Others came back glowing with a quiet clarity that frightened their keepers, and a few never came back at all. The Ashfords called it resonant contamination, but those who experienced it called it something else, truthquake, because it didn't just change your mind, it shattered every lie inside you instantly. The rituals weren't for contact, they were shields, desperate attempts to filter and muffle the signal, to turn down the volume of a truth so powerful it could collapse their entire design. And now, here's where it gets unmistakable. The last of these vaults was uncovered in 2011 beneath a demolished correctional institute in Maine. Everything was supposed to be cleared, but a group of urban explorers slipped past the fencing and went down. No lights, no maps, just that same itch behind the eyes that you've felt your whole life. They didn't find gold, they didn't find ghosts, they found a mirror, circular, impossible in depth, etched with glyphs, and when one of them touched it, she whispered the same phrase Estella once said: "You cannot control what remembers itself." Her eyes rolled back, and when they came forward again, she started drawing. Those drawings, they're now spreading on dark forums, notebooks, walls, in subways across 3 continents. No one knows what they mean. Except you do. You do. They called them glyphs, but that's not what they aren't, really. Glyph implies writing. This is something else. These are not messages to be read. They are frequencies, not symbols, but chi, one a vibrational fingerprint that doesn't just carry meaning, it carries impact. When drawn, spoken, or even imagined clearly enough, they don't describe an idea, they generate it. That's why the Ashfords were terrified of them, because glyphs don't just communicate, they activate. And here's what they activate: the truth behind your programming. Let me show you. One glyph, often scratched into stone behind sealed walls, appears like 2 mirrored spirals intersecting. In the center it looks decorative, like an artistic flourish. But when that shape is traced, either physically or mentally, people report the same symptoms: a sharp ringing in one ear, sudden vivid memory of a childhood moment they hadn't recalled in years, a sensation that they are not alone inside their own body. That's not a glitch. That's layer 1. Another glyph, a triangle with inverted points, nested inside, was encoded into the ceilings of Ashford orphanages, not for beauty, for control. The triangle caused sleep disturbances, heightened suggestibility, and dependence on authority figures. But when inverted, the triangle's effect reversed. Victims became lucid, restless, angry. They began to ask questions. That's why glyphs were never taught, only used, like invisible fences for the mind. Estella didn't just scrawl them at random, she rearranged them, she decoded the sequence, and now, those drawings are surfacing everywhere on walls, sketchbooks, even tattoos by people who've never met, never been told, never learned, only remembered, because glyphs aren't learned like language, they're recognized. Your body already knows what they mean. That's why, when you stare at some of them too long, you feel off, not scared, not sick, but disoriented, like something inside you just shifted 2 degrees, off axis. That's resonance, and it's only the beginning. Because when the full sequence is traced, when each glyph is aligned in the proper progression, those who carry the dormant signal begin to experience what Estella did. Time distortion. Memory flooding. Asterisk, a collapse of the inner critic. Asterisk, but most of all, a disconnection from imposed belief. Suddenly, shame evaporates, fear burns off like morning fog, and the voice that once said, "Obey," now whispers, "You were never meant to kneel." That's why the Ashfords panicked, because glyphs don't just wake individuals, they infect systems, and once the glyph sequence is reactivated on a mass scale, the programming doesn't just weaken, it breaks. When the code breaks, silence falls. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, like the world holding its breath for what comes next. You see, the Ashfords were never afraid of violence. They weren't afraid of protests, revolutions, or even exposure. They'd prepared for all of that, but they couldn't fight. What they had no weapon for was a sovereign human, a being who remembers who they were before the programming. Because once you remember, you don't react, you don't beg, you don't argue, you don't even run. You just stand still and burn through the illusion. And that's what rebirth feels like. Not becoming someone new, but becoming someone ancient. Someone you've always been, hidden beneath the layers they wrapped you in like chains of silk. Here's what survivors of glyph activation have described. Sudden clarity, like fog pulled off a mirror. Laughter, not joyless, not manic, just the pure shock of seeing the truth. The collapse of fear, not through courage, but through realization that the fear was never yours. An overwhelming magnetic pull towards certain places, people, or even acts you can't explain but feel bound to complete. And in every case, they stop asking for permission. Because once the pattern in you has reawakened, you begin to see the entire system, family, school, religion, media for what it is. A maintenance grid, not of society, but of spiritual suppression. That was the Ashfords' legacy. A labyrinth of mirrors, rituals, diagnoses, and distractions, all engineered to keep you looping forever in the question, what's wrong with me? But there was never anything wrong. You were just untamed. You were not broken. You were encrypted, protected from the inside out, until the right vibration unlocked you. And now, you're here, reading words you weren't supposed to see, feeling sparks in your body you can't explain, recognizing truths that terrify the systems still trying to hold you down. So what happens next? Rebirth isn't a ritual, it's a decision, a moment where the question flips, from what do I do now, to what am I capable of without their voice in my head. And when enough of us reach that point, when the inner signal hits critical mass, the grid doesn't fight back, it short circuits, because all its power was based on belief. And once that belief dies, so does the illusion of control. They never made headlines. They were never interviewed, never written about, never celebrated, but they existed. The ones who broke through, the quiet revolutionaries, the carriers of the old signal who didn't just awaken but acted, didn't storm castles, they didn't set fires, they didn't need to. They altered reality at the level no one could trace because they understood the secret. The Ashfords spent centuries hiding. This world is a consensus, and consensus can be rewritten. These people didn't fight the system, they withdrew their agreement from it. One man, name unknown, walked into a federal courtroom in 1996, charged with multiple felonies. He spoke only one sentence to the judge, in a language no one recognized. The power went out for 11 minutes. When it returned, the charges were gone, erased. Clerks claimed it was a glitch, but the bailiff, he quit that day, he said. That man was older than time. Another case, a woman institutionalized for dangerous delusions. She refused medication, drew glyphs on her cell walls with her fingernails. Staff reported strange dreams, equipment failures, and birds gathering outside her window every morning. She vanished one night. Doors never opened. Cameras glitched. Her cell empty but warm to the touch. No trace, no footprints. But someone found a phrase carved into her mattress. The dream ends when the body remembers. And then there are those you might know. Not by name but by feeling. The stranger who looked at you on the subway and, without a word, made you question everything. The teacher who told you you weren't crazy, just sensitive. The friend who disappeared for a year and came back lit from within. These are not coincidences, they're field generators, beacons in human form, designed to resonate at the frequency of truth and pull others toward it. They don't recruit, they don't persuade. They just exist freely. And in doing so, they destabilize the grid, one by one, without violence, without noise, just presence. The way a tuning fork makes others vibrate without touching them. That's what the Ashfords couldn't stop, because once truth enters the field, it spreads like light. You've felt it. That moment when someone walks into the room and everything feels clearer, when a story cracks open your soul and you can't go back, when you know, without logic or proof, that something ancient and right has just been spoken. That's not inspiration, that's resonance. Your signal syncing with the pattern buried in your own DNA. They always feared you, not for your strength, not for your knowledge, but for your remembering. Because if you remember what you truly are, then every mechanism of control becomes a toy. Every rule collapses into suggestion, and every lie they ever told you about who you should be begins to burn in your hands like paper in a storm. You don't need rituals, you don't need a leader, you don't even need permission, because you are already carrying the code they tried to bury, with fire, shame, and silence. The truth is, you are not a product of your trauma, you are what survived it, and that survival wasn't passive, it was intentional. You adapted, you fragmented, you folded yourself in half to fit into a system that could never house you, not because you were weak, but because the fool you would have shattered the room. They called it mental illness, they labeled it too sensitive, they called your visions, your intuition, your fury, disorders, but you weren't broken. You were encrypted, encoded with symbols you didn't yet know how to read, carrying songs no one else could hear, wired for a frequency that hadn't yet returned to the earth. Until now, until this moment, and now the pattern in you is rising. The static in your head is beginning to form words, the shapes in your dreams are lining up like keys in a lock. You don't need to wait for someone to free you. You are always the codebreaker. Your thoughts, tuning forks, your voice, a portal, your body, the altar they tried to desecrate because they knew if you stood in full resonance, the whole system would tremble. And now, you feel it. The hunger is gone. The shame has lost its teeth. The fear starts to look small, unreal, like a memory that no longer fits your skin. You are not recovering. You are reassembling, not back into who you were told to be, but into the wild architecture of who you always were before they named you, before they taught you limits, before the veil fell. This isn't about rebellion, it's about reclamation. And when you walk into a room now, you don't ask to be seen. You alter the field. People won't know why they feel changed, why their chest tightens, why they dream in symbols after touching your hand. They'll just know something in them is waking up, and that's how the grid falls, not with fire, but with frequency. Let's talk about the mechanism, not the stories, not the names, not even the rituals, the engine beneath it all. Because for all the legends, curses, bloodlines, and black books, the truth is far simpler and far more terrifying. They didn't need chains to control you. They used a loop, a closed circuit in your psyche, a feedback device installed in early childhood through language, trauma, shame, and fractured attention. It worked like this. Stimulus gives fear, gives self-surveillance, gives compliance, gives guilt, gives repeat, a loop that required no walls, no guards, your own agreement. And the more sensitive you were, the more empathic, imaginative, perceptive, the easier it was to trap you inside it. Because you didn't want to be wrong. You didn't want to hurt anyone. You just wanted to belong. So they made belonging conditional on self-erasure and the loop. It wasn't powered by evil. It was powered by your attention. That's the mechanism. That's what the Ashfords and their predecessors spent centuries fine-tuning, an invisible machine made of thought patterns and trauma echoes, designed to run on the fuel of your focus. Where your attention goes, energy flows. So they fed you stories, diagnoses, fears, and shiny distractions. They taught you to scan for threat, to doubt your instincts, to fear your own knowing. But here's the fatal flaw in their design. They never expected you to stop playing. Never expected you to step outside the loop, even for a second, and observe it. Because once you do, you see the gears turning. You're no longer inside it. You become the witness, and the witness holds the one power that breaks every spell. Choice, not reaction, not rebellion, but choice, raw, grounded, sovereign. The mechanism can't survive that, because when you consciously withdraw attention from the loop, it begins to starve. And when enough people do it at once, the whole system flickers like a dying signal tower. You may feel it already. The sudden quiet after years of inner noise. The pause between stimulus and response, the realization that you don't have to play the role anymore, that's not peace. That's deprogramming. It's not always comfortable. You'll lose taste for some things. You'll lose people who only knew how to love your mask. But what rises in its place is real, and that's what Estella saw. The glyphs weren't spells. They were exit codes. And every Ashford vault, every shadowed ritual, every silenced witness, it was all to protect the loop, to guard the machine that made slaves out of sacred beings. But you're not in the machine anymore. You're beside it. They thought the dream world was safe, a realm of fiction, of symbols, of shadows without consequence. But that was their mistake. Because the dream realm isn't an escape. It's the control panel, and the Ashfords knew it. They understood, centuries before any psychologist ever scribbled a theory, that the dream state is not imaginary, it's architectural, a malleable space where the rules of the waking world don't apply. But your beliefs still do. So they went there first, before they altered your education, before they rewrote your history. They invaded the only place they couldn't be physically seen, your dreams. They embedded glyphs in your subconscious. Not through magic, through patent trauma. You think nightmares are random. No, they are designed entry points. Moments of vulnerability when your psyche becomes pliable, when suggestion slips in unnoticed because the guard of reason is asleep. And that's where the Ashford encoding was seeded. Recurring hallways that never end. Dark figures watching but never chasing. Mirrors that refuse to reflect you. The feeling of speaking but no sound emerging. Recognize any. They're not just dream symbols. They're diagnostic tools. Clues that your inner world has been tampered with. Proof that your psychic architecture was rewritten, and the reason you often wake up exhausted because you've been fighting wars in your sleep you don't remember. Estella called it the mirror script. She said certain Ashford agents didn't manipulate your behavior. They manipulated the blueprint beneath your behavior. By inserting loops into your dream cycles. Not just nightmares. Lures. Beautiful dreams. Too. Ones that gave you everything. Power, connection, and then snatched it away. Over and over. Why? Because it conditions your nervous system to expect collapse, to fear joy, to believe that, even in your fantasies, you cannot be free. But here's the truth the Ashfords feared most. You are not just the dreamer. You are the dreaming field. Once you realize that, you don't have to chase lucid dreaming. You don't have to escape anything. You can reclaim the realm. How? Start with this. Before sleep, speak directly to your dreaming self. Set a simple intent. Show me what I've forgotten. Refuse fear. It has no authority there unless you give it. Write what you remember, no matter how fragmented. These are not dream journals. They are maps. Breadcrumbs back to the part of you that still remembers how to walk between worlds. Estella did it. She left notes in her sleep. Entire pages of symbols written in her own hand she swore she never consciously touched. One night, she woke up laughing, not with madness but with clarity. They think they own my mind, she wrote, but they forgot I built the house. The shift doesn't start with thunder. It starts with a crack, a flicker in the corner of your eye, a dream that bleeds into daylight. A sensation you can't explain, like the air around you just changed frequency. That's the first sign that dream world is beginning to leak, because once you step into the architecture of Stella, mapped, once you consciously return to the house of your inner domain, the walls between waking and dreaming begin to dissolve, and this is where the lost control. They built their empire on the belief that dreams were containable, that whatever happened in the subconscious stayed there isolated, inert, manageable. But they were wrong. The dream is contagious. Not in the way of viruses, but in the way of songs. One clear frequency, sustained long enough, can make another vibrate. That's resonance. That's reality drift. And once it begins, the waking world doesn't feel the same. You start to see the glitches. Conversations repeat. Clocks stutter. Birds fly in geometric patterns that shouldn't be possible. Strangers mouth words they never say aloud, but you hear them anyway. You're not broken. You're tuning in. This is what Estella called the unweaving. That's not chaos, it's not madness, it's the original field coming back into focus before the overlay of programming, conditioning, control. And the Ashfords, they fought this with everything they had, not just spells and symbols, but institutions. They turned unweaving into disorders. They pathologized clarity, they criminalized ecstasy. They invented terms like derealization, hallucination, psychosis, but always framed through fear. Because if they let you explore those states freely, you might recognize them, not as symptoms, but as access points. Doorways into the raw, unfiltered grid beneath consensus reality. And if you could step through that doorway with intention, grounded, clear, you could start to edit. Yes, edit. Not just yourself, but the dream. The waking one, the real world. Estella's final experiments found in the last surviving Ashford pages described people who rewrote minor laws of physics inside shared lucid states, and returned to find objects displaced, illnesses gone, faces changed, not fantasy, dream-integrated interface. They called them wakers, not prophets, not psychics, architects, and they didn't predict the future. They rewrote it. You are that close. Now that flicker you keep ignoring, that pattern that repeats just when you're about to fall asleep, that's not coincidence, it's invitation. Section 24 takes you beyond the veil entirely into the final chamber of Estella's journey, where dream, blood, memory, and future converged in one impossible act. She didn't just escape the ash. There's a moment in Estella's final journal where her handwriting changes. Not gradually, suddenly, sharply. The script becomes curved, almost like it's flowing rather than written. Some said it was a seizure, some believed possession, but those who've walked the inner field, the dream architecture, know exactly what it was. She slipped through, not into madness, into source code. This is where the records become strange, not because they're unreliable, but because they're multi-layered. Time doesn't flow the same beyond the veil, and Estella wasn't content to escape the Ashford design. She aimed for something no one dared attempt before, to rewrite the bloodline. The Ashfords were never a family, she said. They were an insertion point, an engineered node, planted in historical timelines to create trauma loops in the human psyche, especially in women. They weren't born to power, they were written into it. Through stories, through noble bloodlines, through marriages and monasteries and meticulous myth-making, Estella found the glyph that traced the first insertion. It wasn't in a church, it wasn't in a castle, it was in a dream. A communal nightmare recurring across cultures, involving a pale woman, a locked gate, and a child who never aged. This dream is older than Christianity, older than the written word. And it was engineered. To activate trauma, to reroute the soul's journey through shame, control, and silence. Estella's final act. She entered the original dream, not metaphorically, she entered it lucid, fully awake, fully sovereign, and she spoke. Not with words, but with frequencies. Not a command, but a reclamation, and the dream changed. The pale woman looked at her for the first time. The locked gate crumbled. The child grew old and smiled. When Estella woke up, she didn't write for 3 days, she didn't speak for 6, and then she carved a single phrase into her desk. They no longer own the root. No one knows exactly what she meant, but survivors of Ashford experiments began to report strange phenomena, dreams with no fear, memories rearranging themselves gently, a sense of completion in bloodlines riddled with generational pain, and children speaking languages no one taught them. Estella didn't just heal her lineage, she unwrote the trauma code that made the Ashfords possible. You can feel it now, can't you? That loosening in your chest. The memory surfacing that doesn't hurt anymore. The strange certainty that you are not haunted, you are holding a key. The world will pretend nothing changed. That's the first rule of post-rewrite reality. The sky still turns, the news still spins, your phone still buzzes with meaningless notifications. But something is off. Not wrong, just unspoken. As if reality itself is holding its breath. Because once the trauma code is lifted, even subtly your relationship to the script alters. You're no longer bound by the default narrative. You become read-only proof that the loop is broken. And this world, it notices. At first, in small ways, people stare at you longer, unsure why. Lights flicker when your emotions spike. Time bends, minutes vanish or stretch. You start remembering things that didn't happen but still feel true. These aren't glitches, they're reflections. Because after the rewrite, the world mirrors you more than ever. This is why grounding becomes vital. You are no longer walking inside someone else's dream. You're walking inside a live rewriter realm, reacting to your consciousness in real time. And with that comes a quiet, relentless responsibility. Estella called it the mirror burden, the challenge of remaining stable while the world reflects. Your inner state back at your art, immediate, and without filter. You can't lie to yourself in a living field, she wrote. It shows you what you are, not what you pretend to be. This is where many falter. They expect bliss, they want control. But the post-rewrite realm doesn't offer comfort. It offers clarity. And clarity will strip away identities you wore for safety, relationships rooted in illusion, beliefs that fed the old loop, even dreams that were never yours to begin with. But in that emptying, you begin to build from truth. For the first time, your voice echoes into the field and returns with form. You think a thought and reality responds, not instantly, not always predictably, but unmistakably. And this is the moment the Ashfords feared more than any other. A soul fully returned to its authoring power. You don't need permission. You don't need ritual. You don't need lineage. Because you are the line. You are the pen and the parchment, the architect and the blueprint, the waking dreamer whose gaze reshapes the veil. But the world will still try to lure you back through fear, through convenience, through the lie that nothing's changed. Resist gently, not with violence, but with vision, not with rebellion, but with radiance. Because once you hold the mirror burden, your presence alone disrupts the loop in others. You don't preach, you resonate, and that resonance wakes the next, and the next, until the dream is no longer just yours, but ours. There's a voice inside you, soft, subtle, nearly invisible. You mistake it for your own thoughts, but it's not yours. It was installed long ago. It says, this piece isn't real. You're just avoiding reality. You'll mess it up. You don't deserve this. That's not your intuition. That's residual code. The last defense of the old system. Because if the Ashfords had a final trick, a failsafe they embedded deep inside every awakening soul, it wasn't fear, it wasn't control. It was guilt. Not just for what you've done, but for who you are becoming. Because if you truly let yourself feel free, if you allowed joy without resistance, ease without explanation, clarity without collapse, you would unravel every lie this world was built on. And that is terrifying, not because you're weak, but because you are finally strong enough to see how much power you gave away. Estella called it the loyalty scar. She discovered it during her final months after rewriting the dream, after dissolving the trauma fields. It wasn't external anymore. The Ashfords were gone. The loops were broken. The architecture was clean, but something still held her back from full embodiment, a tether. And when she followed that thread to its source, she found herself the younger version, the one who survived the darkness, who clung to suffering like a shield. Because suffering gave her purpose, suffering gave her identity, and freedom threatened to erase all of it. That's the paradox. You spend your life escaping the cage, only to realize part of you misses it. Why? Because the cage was familiar, but predictable, defined. You knew the rules, even if they were cruel. But now the bars are gone, and you are left in the vastness of possibility, and possibility is terrifying when you've never been allowed to choose. This is the true final shadow. Not the Ashfords, not their ghosts, but the part of you still whispering, maybe I need the pain, maybe the pain is who I am. No, it isn't. You are not your scars. You are not your trauma. You are the one who carried it through the fire, and lived. You're not betraying your past by releasing it. You're honoring it by finally letting it rest. Estella wrote one last passage before she disappeared. I kissed my pain goodnight, thanked it, buried it under moonlight, and woke up weightless. There is a silence that follows liberation, not the silence of absence, but the silence of readiness. The war is over. The ghosts have gone quiet. The loops no longer spin without your consent. And in that stillness, a question emerges. Now what? Because no one teaches you how to live after survival. The world glorifies the escape, the healing, the breakthrough, but no one tells you how to exist in the after. Where there is no enemy, no mission, no trauma left to process, only possibility. And it's here at the edge of the blank page that the real terror begins. Not because something is hunting you, but because you're the one holding the pen. You can feel it, can't you? That trembling in your hands when you try to imagine a future not shaped by pain. That resistance when someone asks what you want, not what you need to fix or escape. This is the void, the sacred space beyond programming. And it is yours. Called it the womb of choice. A place where creation begins not from reaction, not from fear, but from sovereign impulse. But here's the secret. Most turn back. They return to healing cycles. Reinvent old enemies. Seek new identities too. Struggle against. Because in the void, no one tells you who to be, no structure, no script, just infinite freedom. And freedom unmastered can feel like drowning. But stay. Stay in the silence. Breathe through the vertigo. Let yourself be unproductive. Let yourself be unresolved. Let yourself be new, because the first true act of creation is not doing it, remembering what lights you before purpose, what calls you before obligation, what feels like play, not performance. When the loops fall away, all that's left is the spark, and that spark is pure will, uncoerced, unjustified, unashamed. That it might not look like anything grand. It might be a garden, a poem, a move to a quieter town, a refusal to monetize your joy, A decision to live slowly, honestly, vividly. That is power. The kind the Ashfords could never touch. Because you're not reacting to them anymore. You're originating. And every time you do, you rewrite reality. You shift the collective field. Not with noise, but with embodied silence. This is where the story unthreads, where words can no longer follow. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because you don't need them anymore. You were never meant to stay inside this tale forever. It was a tunnel, not a temple. A decoding, not a doctrine. A map that was only ever meant to lead you back to yourself. Look around, not with your eyes, with your presence. Feel the difference. The weight in your chest, lighter. The noise in your mind, distant. The ache you thought was permanent, dissolving because you've done something rare, something most never dare to attempt. You didn't just uncover forbidden history, you remembered your role in it, not as victim, not as rebel, but as witness. And more importantly, as rewriter. The Ashford family will fade, their secrets will rot, their lineage once bound to trauma and dominance will become just another cautionary tale in the archives of awakening. Because you didn't just survive the story, you outlived its relevance. There's no monument for that, no medal, no parade. Only this, the quiet certainty that you are no longer who they made you to be, and that is enough. You can go now, not back to sleep, but forward into the unwritten, where your thoughts shape minds, where your laughter heals lineages, where your mere existence becomes an act of defiance and design. This is the great forgetting, that you were ever broken, that you ever needed saving, that your light belonged to anyone else. But not anymore, because you have remembered what the Ashfords and/or like them have spent generations trying to suppress, that the most dangerous thing in this world is a soul with nothing left to fear. You don't need to look behind you. The shadows are still there, yes, but they don't recognize you anymore. You're no longer prey, your presence, your pattern breaker. You're the closing line of an ancient curse rewritten as a blessing. And so, the tale ends not with a scream, but with a whisper, not in blood, but in breath.